Thank you, Jacob. It's really good to be here, and thanks for letting me come speak to you today. So as Jacob said, I work at the GLA in what we call our City Intelligence Unit, where I manage our demography team and several other teams of policy analysts. We provide evidence for the mayoral team. We work very closely with the policy teams, developing strategies, and we provide data and services for London's boroughs and other organisations like Transport for London. And I've had the pleasure of working both with the Consumer Data Research Centre, and if there's anyone here from the Centre for Population Change, and both those organisations have done some great projects for us. So it is really great to be here, and I do hope that my presentation this afternoon will be of interest. Just sort of by way about how I'll operate, I'm looking at a computer slightly to the side of me, so if it looks like I'm looking in a weird angle, that's why. And just also to say that at some point in the next hour, there's a couple of teenagers coming home from school who I hope won't be coming in, but you know, with this remote working, you know, you can never tell, so please ignore any interruptions. So just a little bit about me, if I can move this on. Here we go. So I've worked as an analyst for almost 30 years now, and the pictures on this slide here represent a variety of jobs that I've done. I started at the ONS, and among many things there, I designed the original census question measuring the relationship of each person to every other person in their household, something that we insisted would be impossible, but when we tried it, it was actually surprising how easy most households managed it. I then worked in other government departments in work and pensions on the merger of the Benefits Agency and the Employment Service to form Job Centre Plus. I worked at the Culture, Media and Sport department on programmes like the evaluation of London's 2012 Olympics. And then I moved out of government, first to the charity Age UK, supporting funding bids to provide services for older people and things like IT, and then into the British Film Institute to provide evidence to support British filmmakers. But surprising as it may seem, I actually found that I didn't enjoy the glamorous world of yacht parties in Cannes and all of that sort of thing, and I missed the grittier world of social policy. So when the job came along at the GLA, it was just after I'd been a school governor and the local council asked us to double the size of our school. As governors, we couldn't understand why they'd want places for so many children, but I found these school place projections on their website, and I was really impressed with how they were done and how they were produced, and the, you know, the quality issues that went into making the estimates. So this job sort of seemed to offer me the opportunity to understand what was going on in the city, and I was really excited to take it. So that's how I came to be here. I'd like to start today thinking about complex cities by sort of considering how London has grown and become more complicated over time. So the beautiful illustration you can see on the left is from the Children's Britannica Encyclopedia and illustrates London in Roman times. And the same area you can just about make out as a tiny white blob in the map of London today on the right-hand side. I'm just going to sort of give a few thoughts about managing the two cities from a policy perspective. So, you know, it seems to me that the city on the left looks a lot easier to manage in Roman times. It's only a square mile, no need for public transport systems to develop and maintain in order to manage congestion. There's only one river crossing point to the sort of equivalent of a Roman industrial estate, some warehouses on the south bank. No issues for north-south social integration. There was a very small population, quite a stable social structure, even if social mobility was very poor. Your status was determined really by your position at birth, and perhaps that's actually not that much different today with what we've heard about the decline in social mobility. The city was a great place for international trade. It had a favourable climate with good air quality. It had a sheltered port and easy access to the rest of Europe, and housing was relatively cheap. And one thing we know about the Romans is that they were very good at measuring their population when they wanted to tax people. They invented the census, a methodology we still rely on today. Health services, though, were pretty poor and life expectancy was very low. If you survived to the age of 5, which was at best a 1 in 2 chance, you might expect to live to around 40, and the city wasn't very resilient to shocks. So today, this city, Londinium, would be just a ward in one of London's boroughs, and London is this huge city region that's now 1,700 kilometres square. So what am I going to do today? Well, I'm going to sort of talk through why cities have grown and the dynamic forces that are shaping London. I'd like to think about how we measure cities to make policy, and I'm going to talk through 2 examples. The first is our population projection modelling, which I think demonstrates how we understand the dynamism of London's population. And then as I sort of learned more about the sort of work that you guys do, I decided to go off piste and do a case study on how we've responded to COVID-19 and the different ways we've been using data to do this, because I know it's a subject people are quite interested in, and it's certainly been a challenge for us that's caused us to rip up our rule book in how we do things in many ways. So that's what I'm intending to cover. And I think what I hope to achieve in the next 30 to 40 minutes really is to help you understand how the evidence requirements for policymakers have changed in response to the increased growth and complexity of cities. It isn't enough to have a census every 10 years anymore. We need a vast range of analytical work to understand the population on a sort of near continuous basis. Also to help you understand how we use data and analysis to make policy and understand cities in the current era, including things like our response to COVID-19. And I hope that in doing so, it will help you understand how your work can help the policymakers of today. Because I know that you're, a very, very practical focused unit, and just talking to some of you just before I started, it's really interesting to understand the work that you're doing. So I'm going to start with London's population growth. London has always grown through international trade and the resulting increase in migration and population that brings. When I say London has always grown, I don't mean it's grown continually, because it's fallen during major shocks such as plagues, famines and wars. And you can see from this chart that after the outbreak of the Second World War, London's population fell steadily and only started growing again in the 1990s. And during that time, cities weren't really seen as desirable places to live. And in fact, London's population only overtook once more the 1939 peak in 2015. So it took a very long time to get to the sort of highest population that it's ever been. And today it's just under 9 million. The latest population estimates reckon it's 8.96. People have always migrated to London for economic and security reasons. So in the 19th century, the largest foreign-born populations were the Irish and the Jewish. But in the 20th century, we saw much more migration from a diverse range of countries. And there's a lot of implications for social policy around this, about social integration, how we provide education and health services, and just things like languages spoken. And the graph I've got there shows the growth of the foreign-born population between 1951 and 2018 by country of birth. But I just wondered if anybody knew which were the top non-British nationalities in London today. So I'm very happy for you to sort of suggest or put something in the chat, and we'll see if you can guess what it is. Oh, and I've just shown it by accident. There we go. I didn't mean to do that, but there we go. So yeah, Romanian population is now the largest non-British nationality in London. And since Romania joined the EU, we've seen the Romanian population increasing in London, whereas the Polish population, which was previously the top non-British nationality, has been falling since the EU referendum. And then the other countries you can see in the top 10 tend to vary a little bit, but they're relatively stable. I want to talk a little bit about how London's population is driven by international migration and what we call domestic out migration, people who move from London to the rest of the country. And this is because we need to look at the flows of London's population as well as understanding what we call the stocks. Because that's what really drives the changes. So the chart on the left looks quite old now, but I wanted to use it because it shows variation over time and how migration varies with the economic cycle. When the economy is doing well, we have higher net migration due to higher immigration and lower emigration. When the economy is doing less well, we have lower net migration, so lower immigration and higher emigration. And you can see in the decade between 2004 and 2015, the different periods where migration grew at the start and the end of that period, whereas in the recession in the middle after 2008, net migration fell. And the second chart on the right shows how London grows. So London grows through in-migration and also natural change because fertility is higher than mortality, but this growth is significantly reduced by out-migration from London to other areas. This chart here provides a slightly different way of looking at it, looking at annual flows to and from inner and outer London, from overseas and to other parts of the UK. And the biggest flows, which roughly balance each other out, are from overseas to inner London and from outer London to the rest of the UK. And the data we have actually allow us to understand these flows in a lot more detail. And there's quite established migration patterns, both within London and when people move outside the city. And this often can be predicted from the local authority you move to when you first end up in London. People, by and large, often come to start their time in London, in inner London, and then they get tired of renting and want to move to an area where they can afford to buy. So they move to usually a neighbouring borough in outer London. And from there, often they end up having a family and finally tiring of the bright lights of the city, they move to a neighbouring town outside London. Obviously, there's a lot of other trajectories that people take, and that's one example, but probably the most common. And you can see how we can measure all of these flows around the city and outside, primarily into the wider southeast, although we have a lot of migration between large cities in the UK as well. And finally, in trying to understand London's migration, we have what we call churn, which looks not just at migration into London and outer London, but all of the moves within London as well. The census is the best way of trying to measure this in its totality, but we only get data for this every 10 years. And it's good to see organisations like CDRC trying to improve data in between these points. So based on the 2011 census data in the year to April 2011, you can see the significant migration into London from the rest of the UK, into London from outside the UK and from London to the rest of the UK. But almost 1 million people moved within London, and more recent data suggests that 12% of households in London have moved in the last year, but 33% of private renters. So this is a massive population churn and covers, as you can see from the map, almost all of inner London. And the policy implications of this are that it makes it very difficult for the authorities to communicate with their residents when they're so mobile, let alone having a detailed understanding of all their characteristics. So it makes it very difficult. Migration age structure is, often surprises people a little bit in London. So London, most migrants to London come between the ages of 20 to 30, and at all other ages, London is a net exporter of people, as you can see from the chart at the top. So you can see that spike at age 18, when many of London's children go off to university outside London, and also the point I was saying about families in their 30s and 40s moving out with children, with younger children. And all of this means that London has a relatively young age structure compared to the UK, and the blue line in the graph at the bottom shows that and the impact of that migration. Before I come to some of our modelling, I wanted to consider a bit about the administrative complexity of cities. So as cities grow, their government evolves and changes and new layers of government get introduced. So London's boroughs date back to 1965, so they've been around for a long time. But the Greater London Authority that is run by the Mayor of London was only introduced, I've written 2020 there, but it should be the year 2000. And the implications are quite different for different services. So we see some functions in London that are devolved to the Mayor on a London basis. So Transport for London have responsibility for travel and public transport. Other functions are still managed by central government, such as the health service. And then other frontline services are delivered by boroughs. So there's about 32 different waste services in London, and also 32 different school place services. So planning school places in London is the separate responsibility of each borough, even though almost a quarter of the children go to school outside of the borough where they live. And this means a lot of data complexity for us, and I'm sure many of you have come across this before as well. So one of those things is multiple administrative geographies that you have to try and understand: boroughs, wards, clinical commissioning groups, police basic command units, the statistical geographies that we use, the MSOAs and the LSOAs. And I know, this can sometimes be a real headache when you try and merge data from all kinds of different geographies. It's a lot sort of to get your head around. Data sharing is also a constant problem. So people tend to assume as the GLA we have access to all the frontline service data, and we don't, because we're a strategic body. And I give the example of free school meals and COVID-19. So boroughs were working really hard to try and identify their vulnerable populations at the start of lockdown. And one of many vulnerable groups was pupils who didn't have access to the internet or devices to do their work from home. And by knowing which of their residents had access to free school meals would actually have been a really good way of starting to identify that group. But because so many pupils go to school outside their boroughs, they're not able to share that data without a lot of information governance work. The same applies to school exclusions and pupils who are at risk of falling into violence that boroughs don't necessarily know if pupils who live in their boroughs have been excluded from the schools they go to outside of their boroughs. There's a lot of risks of data sharing if you've got it wrong. I don't know if you've seen, but I had in my inbox yesterday or today a report about the issues with the Department for Education's National Pupil Database, saying that they're not managing all the data governance properly, with things like sharing data with the Home Office and that. And there's huge risk if you get that wrong. So we're finding at the moment they're pushing back our request for the latest National Pupil Database, even though our request is much less controversial. So these things all have big implications for policy making. I'm going to move on to my first case study now, which is how we measure demography in this context, and talk a bit about what we do and ONS do and why they're slightly different. So ONS produced annual population estimates known as the mid-year estimates, and these reflect the actual measurement of births, deaths and migration over the past year. In London, we usually use these as they are, but as we move further away from the census period on which they're originally anchored, we find that they become less accurate, particularly for some inner London boroughs. And we're finding at the moment that they tend to overestimate some populations, particularly children in inner London. So we've been using the National Pupil Database and GP registration data to adjust this in our modelling. If we didn't do this, we'd overestimate the number of school places that are needed in these areas, and boroughs would build schools that weren't needed, and no borough elected politician wants to be responsible for doing that. So that there are real impacts of these things. And then to look at future populations, we both do population projections for London. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we do ours slightly differently to ONS. And I wanted to say that when I compare our work to ONS, I'm not criticising what ONS do in any sense, just because we're slightly different. We approach these from a slightly different viewpoint. So in London, we have the benefit of being able to produce what we think is the best estimate for London only, and we're not really worried about the rest of the country, whereas ONS have to come up with a methodology that provides consistent estimates, not only for every single region, but that all of these sum to the national total. And that's how we try and explain the differences between what we both do. So they're producing the best estimates for England and the individual regions within that, but we can produce the best estimate for London independently of the total for England. So what we have in common is that we both produce modelled population projections for London, and we both use the sort of international gold standard, which is the cohort component model. And they're both very good models, especially when you compare them with other countries internationally. But there's a number of differences, and I'm going to sort of talk through these now. First, there's some very practical differences. So ONS produce theirs every 2 years and we do them annually. And that's because London has been growing faster than other regions in the UK. And so we need them more regularly to help project London's service needs, such as travel demand and revenue forecasting and housing need. We also produce our projections to a lower level of geography that the London Boroughs are very keen for us to do. So ONS do theirs for local authorities, we go down to wards. Now we can only do them for wards because ONS provide the input data at this level. So it is really useful and it shows that we're not independent of ONS in any sense. And thirdly, and I will talk a bit more about this as I go on, is we produce a wider range of projections for London than ONS do. So we both produce what we call the trend-based model, but the GLA also produces housing-led projections, ethnicity projections, employment-led projections, and school roll projections, and I'll explain a little bit more about this. But first, if you haven't come across it, I'm going to go through how a cohort component model works. So you start with your base year or starting year of population, and this would be the last one for which you have an actual measurement or your population estimates. In our case, we break our population down by single year of age and gender. So we have many groups to project for, but this is so that we can best do it based on what we know is happening at different ages in terms of fertility, mortality, and migration. The second stage is that you age on your population 1 year to account for mortality. And then we add in the births in that year, accounting for any deaths among those aged under 1. And then we adjust for migration. So we calculate international immigration and emigration. And then for domestic migration, it's just a little bit more complicated. We start with a matrix because we have very detailed ONS data on migration between each London borough and every other local authority in England. And we don't have the same level of detail as that for international migration. So we calculate domestic in and out migration and adjust our population for this and the international migration. And this at the bottom box on the chart gives us our final projected population for year 1. And then we go back to the top and repeat this cycle for year 2 and so on until we reach the end of our projection period. Now we tend to project 25 years in advance. We're doing it a bit further than this at the moment because everyone wants our projections to go to 2050 because it's a nice round number and they like that kind of thing. But obviously the further you go away from year 1, the less reliable your projections are. And a cohort component model doesn't predict shocks like COVID-19. And this is where the work that we do on some of the assumptions behind the modeling is very important. In helping us try and think about things like this, and I'm going to talk a bit about this now. So there are some differences in how we and ONS tend to use past trends that have quite a big impact. So ONS have traditionally based their projections based on the previous 5 years, although they are starting to be more flexible about that now. whereas we use a greater variety of time periods of past trends because we find that these different time periods are very suitable for different purposes. So we produce short-term projections, which use the trends for fertility, mortality, and migration based on the past 5 years, as these are the most suitable for the more immediate purposes, such as deciding primary school places, revenue forecasting for travel demand, and that sort of thing. And then what we call our central projections are based on 10 years of past data, because we think this 10-year period tends to reflect a full economic cycle. And as we think this drives London's population, it's more suitable for a wider range of purposes. And then we have longer term projections, which are used for longer term decision making, like housing needs and utility planning, like electricity and water and other services. Like that, and the 15-year trend is pretty much the longest for which we've got the time series available. I think we've got 17 years now, but that's really the furthest we can go. And to give an example, I'm going to try now and give an example of how past trends interact with the economic cycle and how this affects the projections that we produce, particularly for London with its dependence on migration. So in the chart on the left, there's a dotted red line, and this is the projections for London that ONS produced in 2014. And then there's a blue line at the bottom, and this was their projections 2 years later, which show a fall in the population. And then there's the black line, which was the GLA's population for this period. Now, the 2014 ONS ones were based on a 5-year period from 2009 to 2014. And if you look in the domestic migration chart on the right, you can see how during that time, domestic migration was quite low because of the recession. So in 2009, it was less, domestic out-migration from London was less than 50,000, whereas in 2004, it had been over 100,000 a year. So because ONS used that period where they felt fewer people were moving out of London, that made the population relatively high. But when they did the next projections 2 years later in 2016, their 5-year period was 2011 to 2016. And so that included more years of economic recovery when people started to move out of London again because they were more confident about their jobs. And you see that by having 2-year projection periods, it causes them to fluctuate quite a lot, whereas we use a 10-year period. So between 2005 and 2014, it covered all stages of the economic cycle. And we find that this 10-year period makes our projections more stable. And so that's why we tend to use it. Once we've done the trend-based projections, we then redistribute the population to account for housing development data, and we call these our housing-led projections. So we take on board planning data about where the most housing is being built in London, because people don't necessarily move according to the trend-based projections, but they move to areas where there's a lot more new housing. And you can see the effect of this in the charts, the 2 charts that I've got here, where the trend-based projections are the one on the left, with a lot more projected growth in outer London, but the housing-led projections, which we say are probably the best ones, have moved a lot of this population to inner London and eastern London in particular. So Barking and Dagenham in East London is where there's a massive amount of development going on, which will massively increase the population. And so we use these projections to reflect that in the estimates that we produce. And it does have quite a big impact, as you can see. We also do ethnicity projections, and what I've shown here on the left is a summary of our ethnic group projections for London. Now, we do actually do them for the full, I think it's 17 group classification of ethnicity. It's just that it was the chart is too big to show here, so I haven't shown that one there, but I've put the link if you're interested in doing that. And these are used by boroughs and others for planning all kinds of services where there might be an element that's related to ethnicity, to do with public health, to do with cultural activities, for social integration. We're finding there's a huge interest in ethnicity at the moment just because of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19, which we've seen affecting some ethnic groups far more strongly than others. And there's a real interest in, more up-to-date data on this, because everyone is still pretty much using the 2011 census data. We don't feel confident enough to produce more estimates at the moment because, these ethnicity projections are still very heavily based on rolled forward estimates from the census. It's quite out of date now. So we've been looking at possible other ways of doing it. We've been looking at Paul Longley's methodology in CDRC, which uses the naming methods to look at ethnicity. We're also looking at a synthetic estimation model, which builds on other data. But I think this is a real evidence gap for anybody who's thinking about doing a PhD or any sort of further research to see how we can produce more timely ethnicity data in between the censuses. I think there's scope for more work to be done on that. The chart on the right is a Simpsons diversity index to measure diversity within boroughs. So we use this technique called the Simpsons diversity index, which calculates this based both on the number of different ethnic groups and also their relative size. And a higher score means higher diversity and a lower score means lower diversity. And we use the red bars in this chart to show the diversity score at the start of the projection and the end of the projection period. So you can see how it changes. So the left-hand side is the start of the period and the right-hand side is the end. And you can see that for London, we're saying Barking and Dagenham will go from being one of the least diverse boroughs to one of the most diverse, but it still won't be quite as diverse as Newham, Brent and Redbridge. Now there's two blue bars in there. These are for Hackney and Haringey, and these actually show boroughs that are going to get less diverse. They're actually very diverse at the moment, but our projections predict they'll go the other way. And at the bottom, you can see that most of this increase in diversity is in outer London, and that is going to become progressively similar to inner London by the end of our period in 2041. Finally, on this subject, I wanted to look at segregation. You see many lurid newspaper headlines about segregation in some cities, but I think London's history and geography means we don't actually have very much residential segregation. And where we do have segregation, it's possibly not what you might expect, because our most segregated areas are actually those with the highest white British population in outer London, areas like Haringey and Bromley, Havering and Bromley. And this does have implications, because as these areas are becoming more diversified, we see a split between the older white British population and a younger population that's much more diverse. And we see that in attitudes to things like policing and stop and search, where attitudes are very much split by age, and it can cause tensions within those areas as they change. I've spoken a lot about our school role projections and the issues with planning schools in London. We need a lot more school places in London, and we have done, and there's a very high pressure on land use, so it's very difficult to do that. Now, we support boroughs by running a service that projects school place demand on an annual basis. We use the DFE National People Data to project trends for school planning areas, and we go right down to using detailed data for classes, for individual years. And then from this, we produce a wide range of other outputs that you might have seen, like our school atlas, and there's an extract from the school atlas in the picture on the right, and you can select any school in London, and you can look at where the pupils who go to that school live by the shading. The orange shading indicates the areas where pupils who go to that school are most likely to live. You can also see the schools that they come from, which are highlighted in blue. And that's used as a much more detailed planning tool by local authorities and other bodies like free school organisations. There's a lot more you can do in the tool if you go into it. You can look at travel time and all kinds of other things as well. And finally, on projections, I just wanted to talk through some of the issues we're having projecting the population for COVID-19, because we're due to publish our next set of projections this autumn. We're currently experiencing probably the biggest population shock since the Second World War, but our stakeholders like Transport for London, you know, really struggling with their revenue and want updated projections. And so we've got the challenge of how we do this. And the way that we're exploring at the moment has been by putting together an expert panel of some of the country's leading demographers and sort of matching this with doing some more advanced scenario planning. So we've invited a group of people to form our expert panel, and they've been filling in a questionnaire about what they think might happen to various scenarios for fertility, mortality and migration. And the aim is that we're going to bring all of this together and meet later on this month and see if we can reach some sort of consensus. It's the same methodology we use with some of our economic growth work as well. And then if we can sort of come to some sort of agreement on at least the range of impacts we might expect, we can then work out how to sort of build these scenarios into our modelling. We're only able to do this really because of the advances we've made in our modelling over the last few years. So we've totally rewritten our model. So we've now got a coded modular R-based model. We're able to run this in minutes rather than overnight. And it was only a few years ago, we were running our demographic modelling in Visual Basic functions in a spreadsheet. And it would be impossible to do what we do today if we still had that. And you've probably seen all the issues with Excel in the news this week as well. So for us, this has been a huge step forward. I guess for some of you data scientists here, that might not seem particularly impressive, but it's something that has been a really good investment of our time, and actually is relevant to the second case study that I'd like to come on now, which is understanding the impact of COVID and providing evidence for London's recovery work. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the outputs that we've produced and show you some of these. Now, it's very hard in these presentations, I found, flicking between like a PowerPoint and a website and all of that. So I've just got pictures in my presentation, but I've put the links in. So if you want to go and explore the outputs yourselves while I talk, you can do that. So I'm going to start by talking about the first output that we started developing, which was measuring deaths. So London was the first region in the UK to be heavily impacted by COVID-19, and the disease spread widely in the city before the full lockdown was introduced. At the time, there was no mass testing, so we couldn't measure cases accurately. And the first priority for us was understanding what was happening in deaths. And as these started increasing exponentially, we were asked by our press team to put together an analysis that was taken from the daily NHS data that was being published, so that we clearly showed the London figures. And the challenge for us was that they wanted this ready for the early evening media 15 minutes after the NHS data were published. And we've never done anything quite like that before. So we built some code and developed an early version of the release you can see using our Markdown. We set up a rota for staff to keep this updated, including weekends and bank holidays. And we found the NHS database was changing constantly, which made our code fall over. So we had to have someone available each day who was capable of fixing it. And we started producing the sort of graphs that you can see here, or if you're in the document itself, you can see the full range. We soon found that, you know, the NHS data was only reporting hospital deaths, which we knew wasn't the full picture. So we developed more code to incorporate the ONS weekly deaths series, and also emerging data from care homes and other institutions like prisons. And we kept this going every day for 4 months until the deaths had dropped to single figures per week, and the press team said we could do it weekly now, although we are thinking we need to be ready to step it up again. As more testing became available, we were able to start doing a similar thing for cases, a similar daily release. And you can see from the chart that this shows potentially an alarming increase of cases in London in, you know, the last couple of weeks. That looks very similar to the situation in April, but you can't really compare the two because testing was so limited back in April. So we sat down with our press team this week to discuss how to make some changes to the chart to make it sort of less misleading. So we faded out that early period before June and put a line down the middle to sort of indicate when, you know, more testing became available to try and avoid doing that. And, you know, we hope that that's going to work. Also, the chart on the right is a way we've developed of trying to visualize in one chart the different trends in 32 boroughs. This is a particularly complex thing to do in one visual, and we think this works quite well. If you go into the link itself to the chart, you'll see it's actually part of an interactive tool where you can change the time period you're interested in and various other things. So together we found that these 2 pages have been the most popular on the London data store for the last few months, and they've actually had more views than the next 50 pages combined. So they have been really popular, and, you know, it's been really good for us to learn how to start producing this stuff at a sort of high frequency and, you know, maintain it. And we couldn't have done that without the data scientists that we've been able to bring into the team. The second thing I'd like to look at is looking at the impact of lockdown and mobility, where there's been a massive amount of interest. And what we've got here is, at the same time, for I would say the first time ever, we've seen a real shift in the willingness of private companies to share data with us to understand what was happening. I mean, I've spent literally years trying to persuade some of the same companies to share data with us prior to COVID, and it's really taken this crisis to make them understand the need to use their data for the public good, as well as sort of trying to sell it to us at massive prices. And I think this is a really positive step forward, and I hope it's going to stay. So we work with one of the mobile phone companies to develop a chart to allow us to look at whether lockdown was sort of working in London. And the chart you can see on the left has a sort of daily bar for every day from the beginning of March. I think this one goes on till sort of April, May time. And what it basically does is it takes the average number of cells that each phone is connecting to each day, on the basis that the more cells your phone connects to, the more movement you're making, the further you're probably going, at least at an aggregate level. And you can see that during the first 3 weeks of March, mobility was very high but reducing, and then when lockdown was introduced in the 3rd week, it dropped significantly and stayed very flat. But people were actually moving more during the week than the weekend, which you can see because the red bars are the weekdays and the dark are the weekend. And that helped us understand some of the sort of panicking sort of going on in the media about people misusing London's parks to have large gatherings, or people using the Easter bank holiday. We just didn't feel that the data was showing that, because people were actually moving less at weekends than they were during the week. The second chart is taken from a mobility release that we've done, where we've been able to sort of follow the example from ONS in using Google data, and also bring in some of our own from Purple Wi-Fi company who run a number of Wi-Fi access points in London and were happy to share data with us, and also Open Table. And a few other services as well in other parts of the release that you'll see. And by using the pre-lockdown level of mobility, we were able to take daily data on how this was changing. And if you look at the sort of yellowy greeny line, you can see there's a really big impact of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme in August, having a massive increase in restaurant bookings, and then that falling again in the beginning of September. So that's been a really useful use of new data for us, and thinking about how we can manage this data to produce really useful analysis. And I really hope this is something that we'll be able to do a lot more of. One more thing on that, the Doughnut effect of reduced travel to central London. So this is a slide that's taken from a presentation we gave to the London Recovery Board, and it's based on Transport for London's analysis from mobile phone data of both commuter trips in the previous week and non-commuter sort of leisure trips, which are on the right. And the green colour shows the areas which have got the lowest proportion of the sort of pre-COVID number of trips that you've expected, and the red shows where the sort of warmer colours are where they've got a slightly higher proportion of the traffic compared to the pre-COVID average. So you can really see that the centre of London stands out as an area where, in figure above, below, Londoners just aren't saying they're likely to visit. So at the end of August, only 24% said they were likely to go into central London the next week. Finally, on data, I just wanted to flag some work that we coordinate on behalf of a European network, a smart city network that's piloting new technology in 6 cities across Europe and learning how to scale this up. So we saw data from e-bikes, which were being piloted in Lisbon and Milan, and it showed their usage has increased massively since COVID, up to 10 times the usage that they had previously to that. And that sort of shows how you can use a whole sort of range of innovative data and platforms to provide useful information. I mean, one of the great things about this project is the purpose of it is trying to build open data platforms so that this data are sort of shareable and usable rather than proprietary, and that we can make use of them to understand what's happening in situations like this. As well as the outputs we've produced, I just wanted to say a little bit about what's happening in London, on how it's being managed and how we're trying to support that process. So the highest level group is a strategic coordination group which manages any sort of crisis in London, and that's coordinating all kinds of emergency services, like making sure there are enough ambulances to take people to hospital and that sort of thing. The transition board and the recovery boards are more sort of strategic boards. The transition board manages a range of sort of immediate needs, like trying to manage London's food supply, which was a huge challenge during lockdown. I mean, not just for London, but I think for all of us, wherever we were living at the time. And the recovery board, which is looking at how to rebuild London in the light of COVID-19. And it brings together all the major institutions in the city to try and agree a programme for how we're going to do this. So we're trying to take a mission-based approach to recovery, and the board has agreed the missions that you can see listed there, and some cross-cutting priorities, such as addressing the inequality we've heard so much about since COVID struck us. So these have now been agreed as the priorities for the recovery, things like making sure we make London greener, developing our high streets to manage the challenges that they've been facing, providing mentors for vulnerable young people, and improving the quality of work. These are the things that we're going to concentrate our resources into these priorities, and having agreed them, we're now at the stage of doing the detailed delivery plans. And our role is really, as analysts, is to support these missions and try and provide the intelligence on the latest developments and the evidence they need to make decisions on what these missions should look like. We also provide an analytical briefing for each recovery board meeting, and we've just started publishing these, and you can also find these in the COVID section of the London data store. So that's the things I'd like to go through for you. It's not very easy to sum all of that up into a few bullets, but I thought I'd have a go. So I hope I've been able to demonstrate the sort of continuous analysis that we have to do to manage a city of almost 9 million people, increasing the big data that we can get our hands on, and also the different types of data. How monitoring change requires developing more sophisticated models and drawing on these new data sources to build them in. I think we've still got some gaps in understanding our populations at a detailed level in between census, but data science has significantly improved our ability to analyse and publish data at speed. And private companies, we think, should continue to share their data for the public good. I mean, I think we've got a lot to learn to maximise the value for this, but the signs from COVID-19 are very encouraging. So thank you. That's all from me. Be really interested to hear any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Vivienne. That was really, really interesting, very detailed and very informative. And I think I'm not alone when I say, I found the presentation very, very good. So we do have time if anyone wants to use the chat, raise their hand, or feel free to just kind of jump in on the mic.
Can I jump in perhaps quickly? Really interesting talk, Vivienne. Can you sort of, when you listen to the news these days, you hear a lot of stuff about reality check and so forth. I mean, in terms of the modelling and forecasting work that you do, your talk has sort of like two halves in it, if you like. There's the post-war trends in population in Greater London. There's the outer boroughs are becoming more like the inner boroughs in terms of ethnicity mix, sort of, and so on and so forth. And then there's the COVID talk, which is really everything's changed, sort of, if you just think in terms of, I don't know, just take an unrelated example, retail structure, there's a complete donut effect in London, where Pret-a-Manger is closing units, sort of, in central London, but the ones in the suburbs, the inner suburbs, the outer suburbs and so forth are sort of doing much better and so forth. And so is there any sense within your group of sort of when the facts change, so do the long-term models, in the sense of sort of at what point does COVID become more than a short-term crisis that re-establishes, say, the post-war trend in decentralisation and deconcentration from London? Is there any sort of sort of thinking like that?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things we really want to sort of ask our panel to help give us advice on. I mean, we went through some of this a few years ago after the EU referendum to try and consider what impact that would have on some of these things that you referred to, and we started looking even at that point about, even if you removed international migration, yes, of course it would have a huge effect on London, but we know that if migration into London falls, migration out of London tends to fall as well. So it really takes something absolutely massive to start reducing London's population. So I think what we've got to decide, if we're going to be capable of publishing projections in the autumn, and I'm not 100% sure yet that we are, have we reached that sort of tipping point? And I think all the indications are that it's quite likely that we have, but there's really very little hard data to go on at the moment. So, you know, all the estate agents are saying, you know, everybody's trying to move out to rural areas and the coasts, and you've got all this sort of qualitative intelligence, but the population data we have, the sort of statistical structure that we're used to living with, has such big lags. It's really going to take a long time to know if that's actually happening. I mean, we see it in our daily lives, the number of staff we've got who are fed up of being stuck in flats in London, you know, with no outside space and not able to mix with their colleagues anymore. They're really interested in moving out. So I think we have potentially reached that point, but it's, you know, unless we're able to reach a consensus with our expert panel and agree how we reflect that in the projections and how long it's going to last for. So, you know, it would have to last for a very long time for London's population to actually fall, because a lot of its increase is coming from natural growth as well as migration. So when I talk about the scenario planning, what we'll be doing is trying to sort of agree how to test all of these things in our model and sort of see at what point all of these in combination would cause London's population to fall rather than grow. But I think it's most likely we will see a very dramatic fall in growth. Whether it gets to fall in the population itself, we know from our earlier modelling that, you know, that has to be very dramatic. And yeah, I mean, we'll see when we've had our meeting in a couple of weeks' time whether we're confident sort of publishing on that basis. But sorry, that's probably not very coherent, but I think what I'm just trying to say in summary is that it has to be a massive shock for London's population to actually fall. But what we're likely to see is a much more reduced growth in future, and it might even be flat. But I wouldn't rule out a fall from what we hear about the economy. I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, very interesting, thanks.
So we have one question in the chat there from Stephen Clark, who doesn't have a microphone, so I'll just read that out. So he said, linking the population projections in COVID, how do we factor in the determinants of the flight out of dense areas into less dense areas? So things like, can we factor in, you know, amenities and gardens, that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
And then you mentioned access to Rightmove and Zoopla data. So maybe you already covered some of that in your previous question.
Yep. We've definitely already got data on gardens and access to green space. Gardens, we haven't really got in enough detail, but we know which groups are more likely to have access to gardens and who doesn't. And we've certainly got some quite nice measures of green space. So where we can't, I mean, a lot of these, what we're looking at is, a lot of this happens anyway, but at a much smaller scale. So, you know, people move out of London or from an area where they don't have a garden to an area where they can afford one. That happens already. It's just working out how to accelerate this. So we will be looking at the groups that we already know are affected and trying to project that forward. We do use Zoopla data, and we have used that for a number of things. I'm trying to remember what we use it for at the moment. Sorry, it's not in my area, but it's certainly something we've been exploring, and we would definitely look at other work that maybe yourselves and others have done with Zoopla to understand how we might use it. We haven't used Rightmove that I know of yet. So it'd be really interesting to hear from your experience. I think when we tried to use it before, you're only supposed to use a certain amount for free at a certain time, and we tried to download too much and upset them. So I'd be interested to know what your experience is of it and whether we think it's reliable enough to use as a data source.
Are you able to kind of decompose? So this is more kind of ad hoc talking, but recently when I was looking for a place, the market agents was saying that this whole moving out of the city centre wasn't a pattern seen. And so in Liverpool, for example, they said that the city centre market is really, really being driven quite hot. And he didn't know exactly why but it had to do with kind of the patterns of work relationships and that. Are you able to kind of pinpoint to a certain degree why people are moving, where, you know, what are the factors and the mechanisms in these models?
We can do it a bit. So for instance, we know house prices at the moment are still going up in London because of the stamp duty changes, whereas rental prices, particularly in the centre, are going down. So we'd have to try and segment the population in different ways, I think, to model that. You know, we also get the sense, and we'd need to look for proper evidence of this, that, you know, single people and, you know, maybe people without children are potentially, it's easy, they have fewer sort of connections that force them to stay, so they may prove to be more mobile. I mean, we might find the opposite, and families with children who want more space for children, maybe the ones that move. I think we'd have to look for what the evidence is that allows us to sort of see that. And then when you start to get that sort of segmentation, well, we know renters tend to be certain age groups compared to owner occupiers because they're older. So you'd have to sort of control for all of these things and come up with a way in our model of allowing those factors to be added in and making sure you don't have any undesirable interactions as well. Because sometimes when you add in these new things, we've been looking at house prices for a long time as something we wanted to add in, which we haven't done yet, because up until this point we were sort of happy with measuring on the basis of past trends and that house prices were reflected in those trends, but we can't do that anymore. So we'd have to test out these things. But I think, you know, something should be possible, just because we know, as you were sort of suggesting, I think that some groups are more likely to be doing this than others.
And just quick, do you do any sort of less quantitative but more kind of qualitative survey type data collection, or even kind of informal, to understand more about what mechanisms, what trends, what data, where to look?
We have our opinion research team collect quite a lot of data, and we did look at that again after the EU referendum, because we were very interested to know what was going to happen to, I think we've got 1 million EU residents in London. And we wanted to know how that might affect their decision making, whether they were going to leave or whether they were going to stay in the city. So we did explore quite a lot of those issues then, but I would say we weren't confident enough at the time to actually incorporate it quantitatively into the modelling. It's quite difficult to make decisions on the basis of what someone says their intention is, because we don't really know whether that translates into action. So we started looking at the characteristics of those families in a lot more detail. So a lot of the residents were in a family with an English sort of partner, they had children, it's going to be a bigger decision for them to move out of London than it was, say, for someone who was single and had only been here for a year and didn't have a stable employment contract and all those kinds of things. So yes, we do look at those things, but yeah, it would be a big decision to build that into the model in some way.
And just a question from the chat here. So Nina was asking whether there's any explanation about why the largest migrant group is Romanian. Do we have any sort of established migration network between the UK and Romania that would explain that?
I would say there's two things. I mean, so it's been said that quite a few of the Romanians who sort of suddenly seemed to migrate to the UK after they were able to, I think it was in 2012, they were actually here before, but they possibly shouldn't have been, so they wouldn't have come up in the official statistics. Whereas once, you know, they were legally allowed to be here, it seemed like a larger group suddenly migrated, and perhaps some of them were a hidden population. But having said that, it continued for, you know, the growth of the Romanians and the Bulgarians, both countries were very similar. You know, it continued for a number of years and seemed less affected by the referendum than, say, the Polish who've been here for a longer time. And I think opinion research and other projects have shown, you know, were much more affected by the referendum decision. And so it was a decrease in one population and an increase in another. But the way if you look at all the rates at which Romanians and Bulgarians were moving to London, it looks very similar to the rate at which the Polish came after 2004. So the sort of numbers and the size that you'd expect, relative to what we know about what the population figures in the home countries are saying as well about who they estimate who's left. You know, it does seem to be very similar to what happened almost a decade before, that there was this very large movement over, say, 4, 5, 6 years. And by that time, you know, a very high proportion of the population that age in the home country had actually left. So it couldn't continue. But when I think the Romanian population overtook the Polish population around 2018, and the gap between the two has got bigger since then, because it's the Polish population shrinking as well as the Romanian population increasing. But it's been very similar to the migration from other Eastern European countries. I mean, someone might have a different view on that, and I'd be very interested to hear it, particularly if you're from one of those countries. It'd be really good to hear from you.
I think I'm the only one in the chat that's from Bulgaria or Romania, for that matter. With me, it was just a case of knowing the language. And actually, that was it. It was the European language that I knew. I wanted to go study in a European country, and that was it. I think that's true for most Romanians as well. But I don't know. At least the ones that I've met in the UK, that's why they came here. They knew English somehow from the internet, or so I think that's a big reason.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't really have any other insight. Also, the salaries are bigger. I guess that's the most important part.
So we have a comment from Nick Behrman, who's down UCL, posted in the chat. So feel free to jump in if you want to ask yourself.
Thanks, Jacob.
Okay,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks for the talk, Vivienne. It was great. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the kind of data suppliers you've got data from, so the Google Trends, Zoopla, Pebble Wi-Fi, and that sort of thing. How's their response been to your use of this data, and do you think they're seeing the value and therefore being more willing to share the data going forward if we're kind of post-COVID, if we can get post-COVID?
Yeah, I think it varies depending on the company and often by the sort of size and maturity of the company as well. So I think Google haven't committed to sharing for any fixed period. You know, it's great for now because it's very detailed. Although there's very little metadata, we haven't really got a sense of the quality of it. And I have seen other people starting to challenge some of their figures because, you know, it's quite a biased group that they're reporting on. So I don't know how long that will continue. The mobile phone data there was an agreement with the government, it would be free for a period which I think was until June. And after that, people they've started charging for it again. And I think mobile phone companies see selling data as a fundamental point of part of their business model now. So I'm not sure we're going to win that battle. But I think the model we look to move to is, while you have to pay if you want the really detailed data, there should at least be a basic data set that's useful enough that's sort of available free. That's what we'd like to push for, or more sort of cheaper subscription models. So the company that we were working with, I think I'm allowed to say actually, is Vodafone. So we are talking with them because they haven't yet set up the sort of commercial model that Telefonica and O2 have got, and we've been talking to them about what would be useful if they were to set up a subscription model. So they've organized their data internationally, and we were saying what we'd like to see is movement in London and compare that to movement in Milan and movement in Madrid and that sort of thing, even if it's more aggregate. So that's where I think those sorts of companies will be going. Purple are a very small company, and I can't remember how that relationship came about, but it was after COVID. One of my team was in touch with them, and they just, I think whoever leads that company has just a positive attitude to data sharing, and all they said to us was, we'd like to be acknowledged on your, on your webpage, which, obviously we were very happy to do. I think they saw it as good publicity for them because they're a very small company, so that's their model for the moment. Zoopla seem to be going quite far down the road of being commercial, and again, they're quite big and established now. It depends on the size of all of these. It depends how well organized they've got their data. I mean, other data we're looking at are credit card companies who used to ask for astronomical amounts and seem to be a bit more realistic these days. So yeah, I'm not really that confident that the true public spirit will win through and we will get access to data for free. I think it's going to be quite a hard negotiation, but just being able to have the conversation at all. I mean, I've met some of those companies, say 4 or 5 years ago, and we couldn't even have a sensible conversation. It wasn't about the money, it was just that they weren't really thinking and understanding their data in that way. So it has been really good, and it, my understanding of how history works is it takes these sorts of big shocks to get that sort of change, but how it plays out, I don't know. I mean, you use so many data sets yourselves. I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are, and I think you get better access as academics than we often do. So yeah, I'd be interested to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I'd really echo the kind of key message. It's the smaller companies tend to be more open to sharing data in some form rather than big companies. That's definitely been our experience. And having a personal relationship with someone involved to help explain what we can do with the data and what the benefits are as well as key as well. Thank you for that. Thanks, Vivienne.
So we have a raised hand, Alfie Long, if you want to.
Hello, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, yeah. My question was, sorry, slightly more specific, well, maybe not more specific, but I don't know if it's a contradiction in terms, but I really liked the commuting visualization map of London with the through the middle and the squares, but I'm also not entirely sure I understood what it meant. So am I correct in that it was TfL using mobile phone data to look at overall movement, or was it usage of the public transport network that they were showing?
Right, let me have a go. Am I still showing my screen?
No, you're not on that.
Right, okay, I'll just see if I can get back to that. Where's the screen share? Let me have a go at going through that one. It's not my analysis, so it's possible I just haven't explained it very well. It's moving. Oh no, that wasn't what I meant to do. Apologies. Oh no. Okay, I'll just bring it. I know this isn't quite the right format, but I think you'll be able to see it. So, can you see this one?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So let me try and explain this better. So it's the number of trips that were made. So they obviously use the data on cells that have been connected to identify when a trip starts and ends, and they're able to calculate a home location and often a work location just because of the regularity of the locations where those start and stop. So they took a sort of pre-COVID average of the number of trips that were usually made. And the way this chart is color coded is it's showing what percentage of those trips were made in June compared to the February average, which was their sort of pre-COVID measure. So the green color in the middle of the commuter one is saying, the City of London is seeing the fewest commuter trips than there were in February. And similarly, the fewest proportion of the non-commuter trips as well. Does that make sense? It'd be better if you can see there's percentages in the boxes. Let me just make this chart a bit bigger, and maybe it'd be easier to see. So you can see here that it's saying Hackney was making 27% of the commuter trips in June that it was making in February.
Yeah, we're looking at we're all looking at my own face, aren't we? Or is that just me?
No, I'm seeing the presentation.
You're seeing the presentation. Okay, sorry, that was I got that wrong. Okay, yeah. No, I feel like I understand now. I would like. Is there a link for that data that I could look at, or is that it's all in?
I think it's a report that's not published, but they were happy for us to use. So I tell you what, I will find that and get it for you.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. I'm just it's my own inability to compute that at the moment. I think, but I'm confused about what they've used to concentrate a commuting trip and what they've decided is and mapping it spatially.
Yep. I'll have a look at that and see if I can locate that for you. If not, I will. Yeah. If I can't do it while we're talking, and I'm not very good at doing two things at once, I will send it to Jacob separately. But I remember the report they sent me, so it should be possible.
I was going to say, feel free to send any links, resources to either myself or to the Geographic Data Science Lab. Just get in contact with us, and then we'll make the connection between Vivienne and whoever has questions if there's any kind of further up follow-up stuff. One other question that's in the chat, Sam Holt. So he works for a rail company in London as a passenger demand and revenue forecaster, and he's asking if we are expecting to see long-term impacts on rail demand or more of a behavioral change for commuters due to COVID.
Well, I think definitely a behavioural change for commuters due to COVID. I think it was starting, we were aware in our discussions with TfL that it was starting to happen anyway, but I think, with lockdown and now the sort of second period of being told not to make essential journeys, we're sort of moving to what I think is a long-term change for at least some people. So certainly to give an example, we were talking earlier about City Hall's potential move, the GLA moving out of the centre of London to a building in East London, and that's certainly on the basis that nobody's going to be commuting to it 5 days a week probably, but it will be a maximum of 2 or 3 days a week. So that does seem to be the assumption that qualitative intelligence suggests business are making, but it's not like that wasn't happening before. It's just a sort of much bigger and more dramatic behavioural change than would have happened without. In terms of a long-term impact on rail demand, you're probably in a much better position to forecast than me. I mean, a huge amount of London's commuting was from quite long distance rail trips in London, just because that's how our railways are organised. They're all routes into the centre. You get a better service if you come from a town outside London into the centre of London than if you come from a sort of suburban service within London into the centre. It's actually quicker to come from, I don't know, say Guildford to Waterloo than it is from where I live. So, in some ways, if more people move out of London, you could say that might be more demand to come back in. But if we've had the behavioural change, it just won't be 4 or 5 days a week. It'll be 2 or 3 days a week. I hope that at least partially answers your question, but I'd be really interested to hear your view as well, because, this is an area of your expertise.
Have you looked at all like switching modes? So people going from public transport to look more driving private cars?
Yes, that's something TfL are looking at. And, the speed at which traffic returned to London's road was pretty, after lockdown eased, was quite substantial. And yes, there's a lot of evidence that people are driving where they can because they're not confident in using public transport. So I think some of our latest opinion data is saying people still don't feel. I know, it's a survey I saw today from Kingston, which showed a large proportion of residents there saying they don't feel confident using public transport. So even though they've got very good links into the centre of London, by and large, they're sort of switching to cars where they can. So yes, we're definitely seeing that, and you can see it just out on the streets as well. You can smell it in the air. But yes, that's backed up by other data with people saying they just don't feel confident about public transport.
So there's still some time left if anyone has any questions they want to bring forth. So like I said before, if anyone has any kind of final afterthoughts, or Vivienne, if you have any resources or things you want to share, you know, just make the connection, either send them to me or through the Geographic Data Science Lab Twitter account, or yeah, that would be the best way, the Twitter account, and then we'll make sure that everyone's connected. So if there's no more talks or questions or comments to bring forward, no, then if that's it, then, well, let me just say thank you very much, Vivienne. I think we all got a lot out of that talk. I think it was super interesting, really well presented, and, you know, just gave everyone a really good understanding of kind of the stuff that you're doing, the work that you're doing, and how we're trying to kind of address this new data world. So thank you very much on behalf of the GDSL and CDRC. Thanks for coming to talk to us. And the next brown bag seminar that we'll be having will be on the 22nd of October, I believe. So keep in the loop with the GDSL Twitter account, and we'll keep posting any of these kind of opening events that we'll be having in the future.